Well, hello everyone. Good Wednesday evening to you. It is September the 3rd. Hard to believe it's already September. I am Scotty Powell, forecaster here at Burke Weather, and you're watching the Carolinas Weather Group on this Wednesday night. It's 8 p.m. on the dot, so we're actually starting right on time. That's a change. So, anyways, welcome to our program tonight. We are going to be discussing hurricane season. We just ended the meteorological part of summer, coming into the meteorological part of fall, but also the peak hurricane season. And tonight we have two great guests with us. We have Tim Buckley from Greensboro, North Carolina, and we have Chris Smith from Panama City, Florida. So kind of got the Gulf Coast covered and the Atlantic Coast covered. Tim had some experience in Wilmington before he got to Greensboro. So with that, I will toss it over to Daniel and let him introduce himself. We'll go around the table, and then we'll start the show tonight.
Appreciate it, Scotty. Good evening, everyone. My name's Daniel Crawley. I'm based in Marion, North Carolina, and I help monitor the McDowell weather page, who we're associated with Burke Weather, for those who may not already know. They cover a four-county area, including McDowell, and we also have Caldwell and Catawba that we keep an eye on from time to time. But, just today's been an interesting day. It's been pretty warm. We thought that there'd be some pretty good thunderstorm chances here in the foothills and mountains of western North Carolina. That kind of didn't happen. Maybe what happened yesterday took a little steam out of the atmosphere. Yesterday we had two severe thunderstorms hit my county, in particular McDowell County. One came about 3:30. I was at the local high school, and kids were getting out of school, and the football players getting ready to have practice, and then it just let loose about 3:30, so that kind of put a halt to things for a while. And then we had another line of storms that coming out of Tennessee around 11 o'clock last night. Here at my house in western McDowell County, I had 2.14 inches. That's most rain we've had in a while. It's been fairly dry across McDowell County. But, enjoying this early September warmth. Looks like we're going to stay in the upper 80s at least for a few more days, and before we have a little bit of a change toward the weekend. But that's what's going on here in the mountains and foothills. I will move it to Matt, and he can tell us what's going on at UNCC.
Yeah, I'm Matt. I help Ricky with the UNC Charlotte weather accounts. Today got pretty warm. It's been pretty warm for the past several days, up into the 90s, and right now we're currently dealing with slow-moving storms and flooding. I'll let Ricky talk about that. It's one of his favorites. Other than that, there's not too much going on. I've been kind of out of town for most of the past several days, so I haven't been really tuned into it. I'll let Ricky talk more about that.
Here. All right. I'm juggling 5 things back and forth today: Twitter, social media, and all different types of stuff. So I just got out of class, and as soon as I got out of class, I realized there was a flash flood warning, then had to walk someone to her car because it's pouring down rain. But it saved me from getting completely wet today. So, yeah, we have a flash flood warning currently up for a lot of the uptown Charlotte areas. They received almost over 2.5 inches of rain so far in the uptown areas. Charlotte Fire Department's performing a few rescues of people who drove through the floodwaters and then got stuck. It always happens, it seems like, in all these flooding events. But if you come to a flooded road this evening, or if you're venturing out towards uptown later, don't do it. Turn around, don't drown, don't drive into the floodwaters, because it's probably not going to go down anytime soon before at least the 10 o'clock hour, maybe closer towards 11 or midnight, as the rain just keeps forming and forming over the same areas. So with that, I'll give it to Scotty, who will take over the rest and introduce everybody.
Yeah, thank you about that, Ricky. We're missing Joey tonight. Joey had some guests out of town come in today, and he is visiting with them tonight. So Catawba County had its storm shield up once again, as he always likes to talk about. So I don't think they got much of anything yesterday. But anyway, we'll kind of turn the topic to turn the show to our topic tonight, peak hurricane season. We have Tim Buckley from WFMY. Is that correct, Tim? Yes. And then we have...
yes, you got it right.
I always get the call numbers backwards, but I got it right that time. And then we also have Chris Smith from WJ... Hold on. JGH, right? I don't have my email up with me right now. But yeah, we have Chris Smith from Panama City, Florida, joining us tonight. Tim's been a guest with us once or twice on our show, so what I'm going to have them do is I'm going to let Tim and Chris kind of talk about themselves a little bit and about their education and where all the weather field has taken them, and then we'll kind of dive into our topics. So we'll let Chris go first, and then we'll toss it over to Tim.
Okay. Thanks again for having me, guys. I've never done a Google Hangout before, so you can hear me okay? Everything's good? Okay,
yes.
Nice.
Yes.
So let's see. I've been doing this now for 18 years. I went to Florida State, got my degree in meteorology, went to middle school, high school in Atlanta. Had no intentions of getting into television. Wanted to work for the National Weather Service, and they had a hiring freeze. And that was back in '96 when I graduated FSU. So at that point, I was like, well, I'm going to join the military and go in as an officer, or I'm going to do TV. And TV ended up working out first. So I've done my tour of duty from, I was in Albany, Georgia for 13 months. Not that I was counting. I was in Macon for 8 years. Then I went to Atlanta and CNN. And then kind of got tired of the crazy schedules and everything, and decided that I wanted to be closer to Florida State and live at the beach and have a little less stress, and back to a small market. And so here I am, living the good life. I get to see the water every day, so the stresses and stuff of TV kind of melt away when you get to see that. So life is good down here in Northwest Florida.
Heck yeah. The only beef I have with Chris is I'm a Gator fan, so. Yeah. you've got us. You got us last year, so.
Well, yeah. It kind of goes that way. I wouldn't have done this like 3 years ago when we were on a nice 6-game losing streak.
That's it. But you got a great team down there in Tallahassee. But Chris, thank you for coming on tonight. We appreciate it. And Tim, my friend, I'll let you introduce yourself.
All right, guys. Yeah, Tim Buckley here at WFMY in Greensboro, and I originally grew up in upstate New York, way far away from here, up towards Canada, actually. If you're familiar with lake effect snow, I kind of came from the heart of that, off of the shores of Lake Ontario. That was about 10 miles east of west of where I was, and right there near the Tug Hill Plateau is where my home was growing up, and we would average about 200 to 250 inches of snow, give or take 100 each year. It just depended on how the winds blew. But that was kind of what got me fascinated with weather growing up, because you could get a foot of snow seemingly just if the wind was blowing in the right direction. So that's kind of where I got my start in weather as a kid. From there, was looking around different schools, ended up going to Penn State in Pennsylvania for that. Had a great time there, graduated in '09, and my first job in TV was in Wilmington, North Carolina, on the other side of the state from where I am now. So spent about 4.5 years down there at the coast. Didn't get too many big storms while I was there. I was there for Irene and Sandy, both of which kind of brushed the area. Irene was a bit more for us as a Category 1 storm coming close by. And then I joined WFMY here in Greensboro earlier this year as our weekend meteorologist. So the funny thing is I never stood out on the beach getting sandblasted by a hurricane until I came to Greensboro, because back a couple of months ago I went to cover Arthur here rather than in Wilmington when I was always in studio doing that. So kind of funny how that worked out. Hurricanes, though, kind of one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, we're looking forward to having you on, Tim. Thanks as always coming on. And I know it's kind of crazy that you was covering in the studio, and then you move to the central part of the state, and they send you back out there in the sand and the wind and the water.
Yeah, it's crazy.
All right, Ricky, I'll hand the ball off to you, and I'll let you start our interview tonight.
All right. Well, thank you. Tim, let's go ahead and start off by kind of recapping what's happened this year, and then we'll go into kind of the next few months. You and I were both down right where Arthur made landfall along Atlantic Beach and Beaufort earlier this year. Talk about the 3 storms we've had already, and we've had, 3 hurricanes and 1 tropical storm, and how that is in relation to the overall season, if we're on track or whether we've had a slow start to the year, something along that line.
Yeah, it's kind of been slow but steady so far from what we've seen. For folks that might not have been keeping as close a track, we saw our first storm back very kind of early in the beginning of July with Arthur, and Arthur formed and then came up the east coast, really came very close to Wilmington, ended up coming ashore right there at Cape Lookout in North Carolina, which is just below Cape Hatteras, kind of the first one that sticks out. It intensified pretty quickly once it was getting over the Gulf Stream. Early in the season, those storms that tend to form really have a benefit if they can get pretty close to the coast because the water is exceptionally warm there. And this one did. It fired up from a tropical storm, which early on it looked like it would be a tropical storm, maybe all the way up until landfall. But what ended up happening is it strengthened pretty quick into a decent Category 2. The thing about Arthur, though, was it was a very fast mover, so it was coming through very quickly. From where I was, where you were, Ricky, in Atlantic Beach and the Beaufort area, it really only lasted about 12 hours at the most. It kind of started raining around 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and it was out of there by 4 a.m. So it was a very quick storm, but again, it still did come into the U.S. After that, Bertha came in several weeks later. That was in, several weeks after the fact. And then we had Cristobal, which is always fun to say or try to say, most recently. That one did bring some high surf, rip currents, that sort of thing to the east coast, but again, kind of got steered out to sea. And most recently we had Dolly that just kind of came ashore in Mexico as a quick little short-lived one. So it's, with 4 storms this time of the year, that might be a slightly below what we typically see, but still, with 3 of them being hurricanes, we're certainly not having a dull season by any means, and there's plenty of warm water and plenty of season left to go too.
Absolutely. And Chris, you're down in the Florida area. What's been the reaction so far for some of the predictions of the season from Florida residents and other people living along the coast?
It's funny that it doesn't matter whether you live in Atlanta or whether you live in a coastal market. They still kind of have the same attitude of, if it doesn't hit here, it's a quiet season. Since I've been here, honestly, we haven't seen squat. We had like Ida, which was like nothing. We've had a couple like semi-close calls, but nothing that, no real impact. I'm not even sure if we've had, other than maybe some coastal erosion, that might be pushing it since I've been here. So knock on wood that it's been pretty quiet. But, folks they're still the same. The seasonal forecasts come out, and I've almost gotten to the point of is it worth talking about? People, in a way, they want to know the numbers, but then they just kind of mock it and don't care about it. And the fact that if you go back a couple years ago, you had like near record setting seasons with like 25 storms and stuff like that. Well, none of them hit the U.S. or didn't impact the Gulf Coast, and so to them, you might as well have had 2 storms. It doesn't really matter, at least to them.
Yep.
Yeah, we could always mention 92 as kind of that year that everyone thinks about. It wasn't a very active year, but yep. Hurricane Andrew, as all the Florida residents know. So.
Yeah, that's what I tell people all the time, and they're like, well, how many storms are we going to see? I'm like, and it's a cliche, but you're like, it only takes 1 storm to have a bad season. 92, like you said, was very quiet. Well, ask the folks in South Florida if it was quiet.
Yeah, and so now that we've gone through what's happened before, let's get to where we are now. We're about, 7 days away from the climatological peak of hurricane season, coming up, September 10th or 11th, I think?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right around the 10th.
Yeah. So talk about, either of you can jump in on this, why we typically see more storms this time of the year and some of the dynamics in play for that across the Atlantic.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So at this time of the year, this is usually at this point, all the water is warm everywhere. If you're one of the ingredients to get hurricanes is you need to have that warm water. And at this point in the year, in the month of September, everyone's got the warm water. So pretty much everyone's in play all the way from the U.S. coast all the way over to Africa. Some other things that we start to see this time of year are some outbreaks of cooler air coming in for the fall season. Sometimes those outbreaks of cooler air diving into North America and into the United States, that can kind of almost, it puts pressure on that part of the U.S. and it can flare up and bubble up some storms on the flip side down in the Gulf of Mexico or in the Atlantic or things like that. So this typically is really when things, if they're going to get going, they start to really get going, especially with those African waves that, for us here in North Carolina, most of the big storms that we get form really far away from the U.S., starting out in the Cape Verde area just off the coast of Africa, and we get to track them for a week or two. This is the time of year that wave train, as we call it, the thunderstorms over the jungles moving all over the Atlantic Ocean, that's when they start to get going. And it does look like right now we're starting to see that wave train, if you will, those thunderstorms coming off pretty regularly. That's getting a little bit more busy. The harder part is getting them to form into storms, and we still haven't seen many of those type of systems get going, but that really could change in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that, like, you talk about hurricanes and why they form and stuff like that. I mean, you look the Madden-Julian oscillation, just looking at it on the computer right now, that's heading into maybe a little bit more of a favorable phase right now as we head into the peak, so that can be encouraging. But, you still have so much Saharan dust, and you have, you have so much wind shear going on. So, I mean, it's still, it's still going to be kind of a tough road to hoe, I think, for a lot of activity moving through, the next few weeks, even though it might be getting a little more favorable.
And Saharan air layer was one of the things, going back to the numbers, that they mentioned this year in terms of overall activity and why it may dwindle that down, or the overall numbers may be lower. And it seems like we have seen that so far this year, but is there, I guess I'm asking for, other people who may not be too well informed or get with tropical cyclones, but is there a number that you'd like to see, an area of less dry air that you'd like to see before you start worrying about more development?
Well, I think the thing that's been one of the biggest problems in the last several years, kind of as Chris was saying, was the large amount of dust, especially the last couple of years. For those that don't know, you really don't want to see any dry air if you're trying to develop tropical systems. And being that a lot of the big waves come off of Africa, another large player in the African climate is the Saharan Desert. And it's right there. It's just above the equatorial area where the jungles are, and you get the big thunderstorms. But that dust, with the trade winds, can get sucked up and pushed over the ocean, and it can travel thousands of miles. It can even make its way into the United States. Most recently, in the last couple of seasons, that dust has really kind of put the lid on big development with a lot of these waves. There's been so much of it in the ocean that they've had a hard time forming into big monster hurricanes, which for the U.S. has been pretty good news. And right now, I was just looking at this. I was trying to share my screen on it, but I was having some trouble. But again, we're looking still at a lot of dust, especially near the Cape Verde Islands, and some of that stretching as far over as the Lesser Antilles, which is where the Caribbean begins to start. So if you have that in place, you're not going to get to see any big-time storms forming that far out. So for the U.S., it's a good thing, but for hurricane lovers and trackers and forecasters, it's it's going to keep you bored, probably.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just dry air; it's also the wind shear across the Atlantic too. Talk about how that changes throughout the year, and why, as we go into September, we start to see less values and potential for some more activity because of less shear.
Well, part of it is, it's things like El Nino and La Nina, things that kind of drive whether we see, periods of, enhanced wind shear or not. And it's, there's been this whole talk about it was going to be a monster El Nino, and then now it's going to be like, well, maybe it's not. But, we have seen pretty much all summer, a decent amount. You've seen a lot of dust, and you've also seen a lot of wind shear across a lot of the Atlantic basin. I haven't looked at what the wind shears look like. I've been off since last week, but as of before I went on vacation, it was, there was still a lot of wind shear out there. There were pockets that were maybe favorable, but every storm was going to go through a pretty significant shearing process at some point if anything did develop.
Yeah, and there's still a lot of shear out there right now, no question. And another thing too is the placement of the ridge. I guess part of the reason sometimes when you aren't seeing big shear or you're not seeing big dust, the ridge, the subtropical ridge, which is a large area of high pressure over the most of the Atlantic Ocean, that can vary in strength and it can vary in position. And a lot of times when the conditions have been favorable for development, the ridge has been so that it's been allowing these storms to skip out to sea way earlier than to a point where they would impact the U.S. Or kind of like what we saw recently, we had this big dome of high pressure over the southeast, the subtropical ridge basically here, which is why for the first time all year, thankfully maybe, we had a big heat wave. Right here in the Labor Day season is when it started to get hot. That heat dome effect in the southeast kind of, prevented storms close by, but it allowed for that dolly to form right there near the Bay of Campeche and stay far away from the U.S. And, unless, if we didn't talk about it, nobody would have known about it. It was a very low impact event for the U.S. And it seems like if some of the ingredients are there, that ridge has been allowing it to not really matter for the U.S. This is going back over the last 5 years now.
Yeah, I mean, you can see, I don't even know if I'm doing this right, but this is pretty awful. But I'm pointing the iPad at the computer screen, and you can see ain't nothing getting up along the northern Gulf Coast right now. That's for sure. This is, I think, the GFS wind shear going out through early next week, but it's expected to kind of stay status quo as far as anything. It's going to have a tough road to kind of go. Oh, one thing, and this is, let me show this to you. I don't know if any of y'all saw this today, and this isn't tropical in nature, so please forgive me, but we had a mesoscale convective vortex right there earlier this morning over northwest. It's something you don't get to see. Kind of cool because of some clouds, but something you don't see every day. And I figured if anyone was going to enjoy it, it would be y'all.
Yeah, I was actually I'd had that on my screen. I was going to ask you about that. That was a pretty unique system to see come over your area earlier today.
Yeah, it's funny. It's so different now. Now, I mean, I'm 40 years old now, and I have married, and I have a kid now that's like one and a half. So I was completely oblivious to anything until, honestly, I got into work, and I started looking. I was like, well, that's kind of cool, and I was reading the forecast discussion and everything. So, I mean, it was as much of a surprise in a way to me as it was to anyone else, which is kind of embarrassing to say, but I guess unfortunately the realities of being in charge of your 1.5-year-old at home.
It takes priority. We understand. We got you. I guess I have a question for you guys, because both of you, or Tim, you were on the coast, and Chris, you still are. One of the biggest misconceptions is when we see the media, not only on a local level but a national level, when you're showing that hurricane or when you're tracking the hurricane across the ocean, everybody's eyes attract to the miles per hour, the wind speed. But that mostly is not the most dangerous part of hurricanes. Maybe you guys can maybe talk about maybe that, because I know if you see 115 miles per hour wind, that draws your attention. But there's more things to a hurricane than the winds that can really cause damage and danger along the coast.
Sure, yeah, and that's a huge misconception too. And in fact, I would almost contend that part of that is our fault. Not necessarily the media's fault, but maybe just meteorology as a whole, partly because we use a scale now that only focuses on winds. It's a category scale. The Saffir-Simpson scale only goes on winds. So if someone hears category 3, category 1, that's ranking it on a scale of 1 all the way up to 5. And the only criteria now that's going into that is wind speed. So we can tell people all day and night, hey, this one is going to be different, this one's going to be stronger or more dangerous because it has a higher storm surge, which does the #1 amount of damage and loss of human life with fatalities. The storm surge is the biggest problem sometimes. Each storm is different. So we're using this one-size-fits-all scale to fit systems that don't always act or behave the same way and don't even carry the same threats. So, with a given hurricane, you have winds that you have to look at, which can be very destructive, but you have the surge, which is huge and very difficult to pinpoint and very impactful more than anything else sometimes. And you have other factors in there that, spin up tornadoes, things like that, the speed of a storm, how rare is it for a given area? Is it going into a hurricane-prone area where they're ready for things like that? Or is it going into New York and New Jersey where they're not? Or is it, battling a public perception where they don't get scared of hurricanes or where they may get overly scared? There's all these things going into it. And, he's like, wind's good enough. Let's just do category 1 through 5 on winds. And that can, I think, get confusing for people.
And now that I'm, in a coastal market, I was in places like Atlanta and stuff, and really in the end, all you really cared about was about the wind and the rain, up there. But now, when you're in a coastal market, you have so many other things that you have to be concerned with, and the most frustrating thing and probably the most damaging part of a hurricane when you're in a coastal area is the storm surge, and that's something that we don't have a good handle on. I mean, now we're starting to get products to give us an idea to share with people, but a small mistake there can have a huge impact on a lot of people if you don't judge the intensity right. And intensity forecasting is what we struggle with the most. So that's something that scares me as a meteorologist. I really haven't even gone through. I mean, we've had some brushes, but nothing significant here. But when that big one finally does come, and you look back at the history of Northwest Florida and you say, well, they've had lots of storms. Well, I mean, we kind of have, but I mean, you go back and you think about it in 04 and 05, and you had Ivan. Well, Ivan was, farther to the west, and it was more of a severe weather producer here, and caused some beach erosion, but it was far enough away, and so people kind of get that mentality of, well, that wasn't that bad. Or, even Katrina, that was more beach erosion. That was even farther away. You go back to Opal, and you're like, whoa, Opal, that was pretty bad. Well, Opal was barely Category 3 and was sucking in dry air and, didn't have a lot of wind. It was more of a surge producer. And I think you could almost argue that you could go back to like 75 with Eloise is like the last time that we had like a full-on big hurricane hit us in a very, in an ideal position, and this place, you look back in 1975, it was dirt roads around here, and now it's sky rises and looks a little bit more like Myrtle Beach. So I think that's going to be interesting, from the standpoint of, just because you've seen a storm, I think the average person doesn't understand maybe what impacts that they didn't see. They just like, oh yeah, we made it through fine.
Yeah, and folks like Chris have a really tough job because they have to fight that battle when the storm's coming, when it's going on. And I know from my experience working in Wilmington, North Carolina coast had it rough in the 90s, but even the 90s now are a long time ago. I was a kid in the 90s. A lot of people were not here in the 90s. We have a fairly transient population, especially on the coast, that have come in the last 10 or 15 years. And so I would go and talk to groups or, retirement groups or school groups or whatever, and the number of hands that go up when I say, well, do you remember Fran? Do you remember Floyd? Do you remember Dennis? Not everyone does. They might hear about it from their neighbors, but they haven't been through it. And so you're not just trying to re-educate and get the folks that won't leave no matter what. You're not just trying to talk to them, but you're trying to talk to people from Michigan, from Minnesota, from New York, from wherever that aren't even used to it. And they don't even know what to do. So it's definitely tough. The forecasting is one thing, and we're getting better at that. But the communication and the handling of it is a completely other can of worms that I think we have a lot of work to do still, and it's a tough battle to fight.
You mentioned the people from other states and areas that aren't too in tune with tropical cyclones, not knowing what to do. My aunt from Boston was down here during Hurricane Irene up in Virginia in 2011. and the storm was making landfall that evening. She invited us over for dinner, thinking the storm would be gone in about an hour. So, just to say, she was kind of surprised when the power was out for 2 weeks. Then there was no hot water or anything like that. So, but going back to the comparing previous years, have you guys heard any comparisons from viewers about previous years in relation to this year?
That's a good question. I don't know about Chris. I haven't, not yet so much, but other than the fact that it's been quiet. Chris?
Chris, you're on mute.
Chris, buddy, I think you're muted there.
Sorry about that. Yeah, that's the thing that it's one of those things. It's a quiet start or it's a busy start. We were maybe a little bit ahead of schedule, but we still had just that one storm. And then, we typically don't see our first hurricane until the beginning of August. People, I think, forget, and maybe 2005, was it 4 or 5? 2005, when we had like that whole parade of storms during the month of July. I think people's minds, even though it was almost 10 years ago, like they've forgotten about the fact that the season is typically quiet. It doesn't, a lot of years you might not even have a storm until now, or you might only have a tropical storm. So I think people, it's more, they don't necessarily draw correlations until, they're just, I don't know, they're just kind of looking for something or anything. But, it's difficult until you go look back on it. I mean, you can make guesstimates looking at, as far as us, because we're weather geeks, and draw correlations based on El Nino or whatever that, oh, yeah, this year's kind of setting up like 1945 and 1963 or whatever. But, to the average viewer, you don't hear a lot of that. It's just more of, it's quiet so far. Typically, they'll form in June and July.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking off that, Hurricane Arthur moving through at the 4th of July, basically, a lot of people's like, man, this is going to be an active season. This is going to be an active season. How unnormal was that for that strong of a hurricane to hit that early into the season? I mean, we're barely a month into hurricane season.
Well, one thing that was really interesting is, it came into North Carolina. We did have the direct hit. It was technically a direct hit, at least. It came into Cape Lookout. But, looking back, someone had tweeted me a question or sent me a question. They said, has there ever been a storm that, made landfall this early in North Carolina? And I was like, yeah, of course, it probably has. Let me go back and look. And, in fact, it was the earliest hurricane to make landfall in North Carolina. I think it beat out the previous one was Bertha in '96, which was a couple of weeks later. But this was the earliest one, and one of the things that made it such a big news story, and while we were out covering it, and pretty much every TV station in the state was out covering it, it came at the holiday weekend. Labor Day, that's a holiday weekend that you would expect to see maybe hurricane problems. But 4th of July, you're usually pretty much in the clear, especially here, not so much in maybe Florida or something where they can get early forming storms. But typically North Carolina's kind of biding our time until the end of the hurricane season, right around now, which is when we can sometimes really get hit. I don't know what you guys had to say about that.
Hey, one thing I would like to say, talking about Arthur back in July, I remember when that storm developed, and there was one global computer model, I can't remember which one it was, maybe the European, was really bullish on it developing. And when I saw that, and I'm sitting here at late June, 1st of July, I'm thinking, climatology just is against that. But this year it happened. That storm, it kind of just sat off the Carolina coast, and it drifted southwest a little bit. And I know I read several different people on social media. They'll, some of them like to be really bullish about stuff, and some of them try to play conservative, and it happened. And it just, that was kind of something that you don't see, but it did happen, and I don't think it had anybody left off guard off North Carolina coast. So, but it was, it was a little bit different.
I mean, that's the thing though with tropical systems is expect the unexpected, and that's the tough thing when you're trying to communicate. And I remember I was a junior year at FSU in '95, and we're over there in Tallahassee, and oh, there's this little storm down there in the Bay of Campeche, and I was like, yay, no dynamics final. But so we're like, let's go over to Panama City Beach, and so we're like, okay, my buddy's from Panama City Beach, and we're gonna go over there and watch it. He'll know how to get us around, and so we go to bed, and it's like a 1, and we wake up. It was, I think, like a 4 maybe at that point, and you know, I mean, it's expect the unexpected when it comes to tropical systems, especially with intensity forecasting. We just don't know what causes these to strengthen. And the good news is, I mean, every time we learn more about it, you know, we used to not know, you know, everyone used to talk about sea surface temperature. Well, yeah, sea surface temperature, but it's really, you know, the depth of that column and how hot it is. Or, you know, hey, what's this stuff with dust? Why are these storms not developing? Well, now we know more. And, you know, we continue to know more, but we still have a lot of questions. So, you know, for something to end up spinning up and being a hurricane, you know, it's tough to know at the time, but, you know, a lot of times you can look back in the post-mortem and, you know, have a little bit better understanding.
Yeah, kind of to piggyback off that, you know, we get the questions, I'm sure you guys do as well, but mainly when they see you guys on TV and you say, man, for Tim's case, this storm's about to hit the Gulf Stream, or for your case, Chris, this storm's about to enter the Gulf of Mexico, a hotbed of just prime territory for this hurricane just to blossom. What is so important about the Gulf Stream and that Gulf of Mexico that really intensifies these storms as they come near the coastline?
Well, part of it depends on the time of year and what's going on. Like with Arthur, you know, at that point in the season, the Gulf Stream is one of your only good shots at getting that nice deep column of warm air like Chris was talking about. You need that good depth there, and the Gulf Stream gets it first, and then everyone else gets it. So when you go swimming at 4th of July off the North Carolina beaches, it's still kind of cool out there. The water temperature is generally in the 70s, but the Gulf Stream still is able to generate that. You know, typically you want at least 80 degrees for hurricanes to really flourish, and this one had it. So that kind of played a factor, and sometimes if that Gulf Stream for us is the only real narrow current of exceptionally warm air, sometimes you can get the storm to kind of hug it a little bit, because it's going to keep on falling its pressures over the warmer water. So for that system, the Gulf Stream aided in kind of scooting it out a little bit as the Gulf Stream curves around the North Carolina coast. Of course, the front coming in helped as well, but that was a key for that one. In Chris's case in Florida, I mean, especially their waters warm a lot quicker than ours do, no question.
Yeah, we're let me see, what did I have? It was 80, 86 and 87 right now.
Tough to
so
take.
Yeah, we're looking pretty good when it comes to the water temperature. We're up at about 89 degrees the other day for the sea surface temperature. You go. Let's see. We'll
That's the temperature of my swimming pool right now is 86 degrees. That's crazy.
But yeah, let me switch this around. Sorry about that. Yeah, see, the sea surface temperature, the depth of it, you know, we have something that's called the loop current, which has led to just, you know, incredible intensification of tropical systems like Katrina. That was one of them that, you know, really benefited from that loop current that loops around and then through the Strait of Florida and up the East Coast through the Gulf Stream. But, you know, I mean, in the end, that's one of the things that helps, but it's not the only thing. So, you know, if you have wind shear, just like last year with Karen, you know, Karen moved right through the loop current, but what happened? You know, Karen, you know, caused me to miss a football game, and I don't think we saw any rainfall from it. So, you know, it was the wind shear that was able to kind of overcome the fact that, you know, didn't end up, you know, getting a real intensification. It fizzled out all because of wind shear.
Yeah, and I guess kind of transition this to kind of off the coast. What are some of the worries that that we have to worry about with hurricanes coming on shore? I know, Tim, you deal with this more than Chris does because you're into the Triad area. But what are the effects that we see off the coastline of landfall and hurricanes?
Sure, a couple things to watch and worry about. We'll talk maybe specifically about North Carolina here. Depending on what part of the state you are, if you're foothills and toward the Piedmont area from the Triad down to Charlotte, there are two different types of systems that we can maybe see. One of them is actually if you have a really good, strong system coming in up the Gulf, coming into Chris's area or the Gulf Coast, and then it gets picked up by a front and it keeps on going right straight over our area. In that case, you're going to get a lot of rain, but sometimes and very often, if we get hit on the right side of the storm comes over us, we can get a lot of spin-up tornadoes. And those tornadoes can be something that are hard to identify quickly, pretty little warning, and they can put down some pretty quick damage. Another thing for I'd say the central part of the state and eastern North Carolina, if those storms are coming in at a pretty solid angle to the coast, you can get stuck with some really nasty inland flooding. And some of that inland flooding is worse than even the hurricanes themselves. The most famous example in North Carolina is Floyd in '99. Floyd kind of just ran right up I-40, starting at Wilmington and going up to Raleigh. And the worst parts of the state that got hit from that one were not necessarily the coast, but places like Duplin County, all the way up into the Goldsboro area, and right in that area where they got upwards of 20 inches of rain, and roads were shut down for weeks, and just disaster, complete disaster too. So it really depends, but depends on what part of the state you're in and whether you get that storm that's coming in from the Atlantic side or the Gulf side. But severe weather is one of the concerns with tornadoes, and another is that inland flooding. If you get a slow-moving storm that can really track into the state.
Tim, I'm glad you mentioned that because this coming weekend is the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Francis. And I think the majority of people across the country remember that for what happened in the state of Florida. But one of the stories that I think got completely ignored was the catastrophic flooding that occurred here in western North Carolina when that storm came into the inland, into the southeast U.S. Scotty knows it well. I know it well. That was probably the second or third worst flood on the upper Catawba Basin in history. And, here at my house, I had 9 inches of rain. I could go up to the top of the mountain on the parkway. We had 20 inches of rain. And it was just a slow-moving tropical storm or hurricane or a remnant of it. And, it's amazing that's been 10 years already. But it can be deadly, and it's not always just on the coast. That's for sure.
Yeah, and that's a great storm. I'm looking at the rainfall map right now, and you're right. Some areas 20 inches or so up against the North Carolina mountains, 10 inches widespread, and a lot of that was orographic. So, you go up the coast, and you don't necessarily get a ton of elevation until you get here. You get some of it in Florida, or in Georgia and South Carolina, but we have huge elevation change, and that's just enough to wring out that towel of moisture, and boom, you get, like you said, a really bad flood from that tropical system.
Yeah, and what made it even worse was less than 2 weeks later we had Ivan, who affected the Gulf Coast, like Chris mentioned, come right up the Appalachians again. You had those awful mudslides in Macon County over around Franklin. To get 2 of those in like 2 weeks is phenomenal. I mean, there were some areas here in the mountains that probably had 25 to 30 inches of rain in about a 3-week period.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the one here in western North Carolina, and then I'll toss it to Chris. That's the ones that we have to watch coming up from the Gulf, because as Daniel was talking about, that was my sophomore or junior year of high school. We were out of school that entire week because our school was flooded. Bridges and roads and everything closed down from that series of flooding. So yeah, it's flooding is a major part of landfall and hurricanes.
Yeah, that's I was in Macon at the time for Francis, and we got a significant amount of rainfall there. But I was just looking at the back of the track. I was trying to remember exactly what the track was. And I mean, that's the perfect situation for, there's the system, and the way it was, that's set up perfectly because the center stayed all to your west, and that just, orographic lifting the whole way. And it's amazing when you look, I was just looking at the rainfall totals, that, a big chunk of western North Carolina was in that, 6 to 15 inch area, but then you go into the, I don't know what y'all call it, the far extreme western part of the state, and it's like 2 inches, 3 inches. So, it's just amazing what the difference in orographic lifting can do in those microclimates. That for a big chunk of the state of North Carolina is, whatever, but, you're talking historic flooding in other parts.
Yeah, so a message for the folks watching this here or anywhere up and down the coast where you might be far away from the beach. If something is tropical headed your way, whatever the forecast is, there's still a potential for it to be more than that. When you have this tropical air coming in, you can often get very heavy rain events that just simply aren't possible from other systems that typically come across the country. Another probably more recent example is Hurricane Irene coming into New York, New Jersey. There was the gloom and doom forecast because it was hitting the Big Apple for the first time in a long time. But the worst impacts from Irene were in upstate New York, in the Catskill Mountains, where towns got flooded out, and in Vermont. And I think a lot of people lost their lives up in Vermont because of some of the flooding there. And towns, just completely got inundated with floodwater, and they probably weren't expecting it. So that's something to keep in mind for all of us inlanders that aren't at the beach immediately.
Yeah, and I'm glad, Chris, you talked about it just a second ago. And by the way, Tim, tell Grant we said hello. We saw him walk by a minute ago.
Grant, they say hello.
Hey, Grant. But Tim, you were talking about it. What is so special about the northwest quadrant of a hurricane, landfall in a hurricane? Kind of talk about that part, because I feel like it gets a little bit of attention, but not as much attention as it should.
Sure. So a lot of times with a hurricane, we try and break it down into 4 quadrants. You'll either call it the northwest quadrant, or the right front quadrant is the best way to describe it. Because if you have a hurricane, say you slice it into 4 pieces of a pie, it's going to be moving along in one direction, and low pressure is going to be spinning counterclockwise. So with that, you're going to get one side of the storm where that wind is blowing into the beach, and another side of the storm where the wind is blowing away from the beach. The absolute worst part of a storm is going to be the side where the wind is coming at you. Number one, that wind is going to be blowing in really strong, but it's also going to take all the water that's right there, and it's going to push it up onto the coast. So those big waves are coming in and literally transporting the ocean from where it is onto the beaches. So when you get the really bad storm surge is when you have that right front quadrant. Typically, if it's coming from the south, it's going to be the eastern side of the hurricane. If you're on the western side of the hurricane, you might not have much storm surge at all. Sure, you'll get some, but not as much, because you're not getting the pushing effect. Instead, you're actually getting the opposite. So that can do not only that for the surge, but it can also aid in the development of severe weather and tornadoes. So if you are going to get tornadoes in a storm, typically you're going to get it on that right front quadrant side, which is stronger and can encourage more spin.
Hey, something else I want to mention. You talk about the quadrants. You've got to also pay attention at the direction the storm's moving. Like you said, I'm thinking of one of the Gulf Coast hurricanes that hit Texas. Not Rita. I can't remember which one it was.
Ike?
Yeah, Ike. I'll tell you the one where Ken Torrey about got his head took off by that piece of debris. If you remember that. He was in that parking deck. That storm was moving west. So it's like the north and northwest of that center was the strongest, because it seemed like, I guess that's in relation to, the actual storm movement. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so if it was coming into the west, north of that track, the northern part of that track would be the worst part of the storm for sure.
And, Hugo's another example. Hugo was, I've become convinced of this. Hugo was almost like the perfect scenario synoptically, where you had both like a 500 millibar ridge to the north of it, and you had, I believe it was like an upper low to the southwest of it, and it was just like a funneling effect. It didn't allow Hugo to cut north and miss South Carolina, and it came all the way inland, and it devastated Charleston and places near Charleston, and then it affected inland areas like Charlotte as much as it did. I mean, just by over the years looking at the way weather patterns and weather events have worked out, it seems like the setup with Hugo was almost kind of the perfect setup. It was really the exception rather than the rule.
Well, I mean, you have Hurricane Katrina too. I mean, there was that brief period where everyone's like, "Oh, thank God, it's staying, east of New Orleans, so it's on the good side of the storm." And that didn't turn out too well. And I can remember that night as you're watching it, and that was like a lot of people's initial reaction to Katrina was like, "Oh, well, probably sucks for Mobile and stuff, but as far as New Orleans, that's what everyone was concerned about." They weren't thinking of the fact that all that water in Lake Pontchartrain being essentially pushed into the city. So there's always going to be exceptions to every rule, and I think a lot of times, and it was just interesting. I remember thinking with Katrina that there was that initial period where like, oh, it's not going to be bad, and they didn't get much rain either, in comparison.
Yeah, I think a lot of people ultimately got fooled into that, and that's kind of the sad part, because you don't visually see the wind and the rain and all that, and you think, wow, we've dodged a bullet, and then what happened afterwards was just devastating.
Sure, that was the initial thought with Katrina when it came through. I remember thinking, wow, this could have been worse. And then the levees really came after the fact. It wasn't right away. It was after the fact, and then it was like, okay, this is a much bigger deal for them. And part of it was human. The levees didn't work. If they had totally different storm.
You guys are approaching the 9 o'clock hour, so Scotty, Daniel, if you have any more questions, I'll let you go towards that. Otherwise, maybe we'll start wrapping it up and let them plug their social media outlets as we get closer to 9.
Yeah, I guess kind of to wrap it up, I know we briefly talked a little bit about it, but what's your outlook for the next couple of months, hurricane season, as September and October roll around? What is your guys' thoughts on that, and then we'll kind of wrap it up after that.
Sure. Yeah, I don't see any reason to think that it's going to ramp up in intensity anytime soon. I mean, we still have a lot of the dust out there. We still have a good amount of shear. But going into September, you always have to look at the waves really closely. And just looking at the latest runs of the GFS and the Euro, which we have to get careful about when we go out as far as a week. But they're starting to see at least a lot of those tropical waves coming off the coast. Now, if they form, to me at least, it looks like that not all the ingredients needed are there. You have some openings in the ridge. They can probably squeak out north, or maybe they don't fall apart too early with the dust, things like that. But you can't rule anything out at this point. I think the U.S. still needs to be ready for some storms to come close, but overall, I don't think we're going to have an above-average season by any means. But as we all said before, we're the only people that really care about that, the people that keep the records and geek out on all the storms. If they come toward the U.S., it's going to be a busy season. If they don't, no one's going to care about it. So I think, we still need to keep our eyes open. Might get another storm or two that's a close call. It's still anyone's guess at this point. It really is.
Oh, our station still isn't HD, and we're supposed to go HD in October, so I'm expecting something around mid-October to probably hit here.
Yes, it always hits at the most inconvenient time.
Or the week you're on vacation.
Yes.
Yeah. I was expecting it to be last week when I went on a beach vacation in Wilmington, but it didn't happen, thankfully. Whenever I'm going to a Penn State football game, it'll happen.
Chris, I guess we'll kind of, I guess we'll put you in TV mode, you and Tim both. Let's say your audience obviously is on the coast, and Tim, as you know, as we live in North Carolina, half our people move out to the coast, when it's warm. So how do we need to prepare for a hurricane? What should we have in hand? what should we do just to be prepared, just in case if we were to see something happen towards the end of the season?
Let's see. So you're talking about like like your kit and all that kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
stuff.
How should we prepare? What should we do to make sure that we're ready in case a hurricane is to hit the area?
That's one of the things that I honestly struggle with, because when you look at like the disaster preparedness kits, it's like, dude, my house isn't this big. Like, and you think about like the average person, and like, you're supposed to have, was it 3 gallons of water or 1 gallon per person per day for 3 days. And you think about, like, you look at some of these kits and how big they are, how I just think about the feasibility of like the average person that's going to kind of hardly do anything anyway, that if you told them, okay, you stack it all up, this is everything you need to have, are they going to ever really have it? But we always recommend, the important things of, you have your extra phone charger, because these things don't last hardly at all. So I just keep mine in the big battery case. But your insurance records, medications. One of the big things are pets. Especially because of Katrina, a lot of people didn't evacuate because they didn't want to leave their pets behind, and that's kind of understandable. So now some shelters, but not all shelters, take pets. But I think people don't understand that, like, shelters aren't like they're not going to provide anything for you short of the building. So like, you really need to kind of bring your own sleeping stuff. You need to bring your dog food. You need to bring their vet records. You need to bring their food. I think people a lot of times kind of expect everything's going to be taken care of for us. And, you're still, even if you have to evacuate and go to a shelter, you're still pretty much responsible for bringing everything that you're going to need there.
I think one of the best pieces of advice I can give to anybody, whether you're on the coast or whether you're inland or wherever, everyone has different experiences. Some people have been through storms fine, others might not have ever gone through a storm. I would always say, don't be cocky and don't underestimate a storm, because, with hurricanes, you have the luxury of being able to plan for it. Even if you don't do anything until you're in the cone, we have a cone, and it's out there many days ahead of time. So you have that ability to prepare at that point. So I always say, treat it for the worst case. If it doesn't get that bad, good for you. You have extra supplies for the next time, But, we were in Atlantic Beach, and I saw Ricky there as well, for Arthur. Arthur didn't do much damage there, but it was still a Category 2 that came in, made landfall, and people weren't worried a bit. The locals weren't worried a bit. Even the tourists, we were staying at the DoubleTree right on the beach. None of them have been through a hurricane before, and they weren't worried a bit. They thought everything was going to be fine. And, a couple things go differently. Maybe it slows down a little bit and sits over us more. It would have been a different story. So I always say, you have that ability to prepare. You don't have that choice with flash flooding. You don't have that choice with tornadoes. With hurricanes, you get advance notice. Why would you choose to ignore the advance notice? Take your time and make sure you have everything ready to go once you're in that threat area.
Yeah, and that's one thing we didn't even talk about was the cone and uncertainty. I mean, goodness, that might be another topic for another night. In case you guys briefly want to comment on that, I mean, that is something that we have to take into account with landfall hurricanes.
Yeah, kind of piggyback off of what Tim was saying, though. I always tell people that no matter whether we get hit directly or not, there's always going to be someone that they're going to be like, it wasn't that bad. Maybe you end up in the dry slot, and you don't hardly see any rain. Maybe you see some storm surge, but maybe you're farther inland. Maybe you're far enough that surge isn't much of an issue anyway, and you hardly see any rain. You're like, oh, what was the big deal? And so I think that uncertainty and trying to convey the uncertainty and making people aware that, a week to, but statistically it could easily end up being at least a 3, and trying to plan for that, but also knowing that it could also be a 1 or maybe even a strong tropical storm, because I think we always get into that, and I've been guilty of saying it too, where I'm like, it's just a 1. You know, well, the uncertainty says that it could end up being a 2, or like Opal, it goes from a 1 to a 4.
Or Sandy, where it wasn't even a 1.
Yeah.
I don't want to get started on that, but that's another story.
Yeah, we might do a Sandy special at the end of October. All right, guys. Daniel, I don't know if you noticed radar, but you got an announced thunderstorm.
Yeah, I just updated the McDowell weather page. I noticed that just a minute ago, and
Good.
those storms are kind of propagating northward.
Yeah, I'm slacking because I didn't even know it was happening. Anyways, Tim, Chris, I'll let you guys kind of plug your social media outlets, how we can get in touch with you, and all that good stuff. Chris, you want to go first?
Sure. I am on Facebook and Twitter. Facebook is chris.weather. Twitter is smithwjhg. And my email address is chris.smith@wjhg.com.
Awesome. And if you're heading to the Panhandle, Florida, make sure you follow Chris, and he'll keep you up to date on all the weather. I know a lot of people around here, they either go to Wilmington, Myrtle Beach, or Panama City, Destin area. So.
Well, I can tell you where the good oysters and cheap beer are too.
Tim, you want to plug yourself on social media?
Sure, yeah. Anywhere you are, you can find me. Google Plus, Tim Buckley. Search for that. I'm the one with the weather guy picture. Twitter, Tim Buckley WX. Facebook, Meteorologist Tim Buckley. Email, tbuckley4@wfmy.com, but I don't know who emails anymore, so just shoot me social media stuff, and if you try to find me, you'll be able to do it for sure. But happy to answer any questions, weather questions, Penn State football prediction questions. I can try and do that too. Ask me how badly we'll beat Michigan this year.
How excited were you with the last-second field goal kick?
It was pretty good. It was like beach. I was at the beach and I had breakfast and was watching football. So nothing wrong with that. I'll take a last-second field goal.
That's why I love the British Open, because you can wake up, eat breakfast, watch golf, and then go on about your day. So unfortunately, my Gators didn't get to play because the weather didn't cooperate last night. Go figure. We have to wait to play East Michigan, and Grant's Michigan Wolverines beat up on my alum App State Mountaineers. All right, guys. Matt, Chris, Ricky, and Daniel. You guys have anything to close?
Not really for me. Just looking at what's going on here tonight. We may get wet here in a minute here at my house. If you ever want to get a hold of me, you can email me at mariancwx@gmail.com. Of course, you'll see me on the McDowell weather page, keeping it up to date. And a big shout out to our fans and our followers here in McDowell County. We reached the 3,000 likes on our Facebook page, which for a county that's got around 40,000 people, and for a good percentage of those people, or not a good percentage, but probably a lower percentage of people compared to any other place that has internet access and has smartphones, stuff like that, we're glad that we got 3,000. You guys do a great job following us, and we try to do the best we can. But I'm going to try to stay dry, and I'll let Ricky and Matt wrap it up on their end.
Yeah, thankfully, the rain's finally starting to end down here after the flash flooding in Uptown. I think the storm's becoming more kind of just raining itself out now, and the heaviest cells have moved southeast towards portions of Monroe and Union County. So they're next in line to deal with it, and hopefully you guys up in the mountains don't deal with the same things later tonight. But I looked at precipitable water values, and they were all over 2, so you know what that means around here when that happens. So, Matt, final thoughts?
If anything else pops up in the night, Rick and I will cover it on the UNCC weather Twitter and Facebook at UNCC weather. Personally, I'll be tweeting from at Firefighter Toad. That's pretty much it. We'll be on it. Awesome.
And as always, you can follow us at burkweather, burkweather.org, Burkweather Inc. on Facebook. We have up to 17,000 likes today, Daniel, so we got that far today, so that's awesome. Next week, Weather in Your Health. That is a Joey Mosteller show. He picked the topic, so don't shoot us. I think we have John Wendell coming on the show to kind of talk about weather in your health. So after that, Hurricane Hugo special. Daniel, do you want to plug that right quick?
Oh yeah, we're 2 weeks away from getting around the 25th anniversary of Hurricane Hugo. September 21st, the actual anniversary of that. We got a big show for you guys. Make sure and tune in. We got Rob Fowler from WCBD in Charleston, Channel 2. Of course, he was the chief meteorologist at that station during Hugo 25 years ago. And we might have one more surprise out of the Charlotte TV market. I'm not going to say anything yet. We want to get a little bit more of a commitment on his part. But, you know, Hugo was such a big deal for Charleston and Charlotte. And, you know, we've talked about Florida hurricanes. We've talked about Katrina. But if you ask South Carolina people and you ask the Charlotte Metro and the Western Piedmont, North Carolina, Hugo's the benchmark. So, you know, this is a big deal for us. And 2 weeks from now, we're going to have a pretty big show on that. So we hope everybody that's watching tonight, and you guys that are guests tonight, come on, join us. Check it out.
Yeah, Tim, Chris, we'd love to have you on there. Tim, I know you love hurricanes, so honestly, if you might want to join on that show. I'll go ahead and call out the guy, Eric Thomas. If you're watching this and you follow Eric Thomas in the Charlotte media, email him. Tell him you want to see him on the show. I think I've almost got him convinced to come on. So let Eric know that you want to see him. Chris, thank you for coming. I know this is not your market area, but we enjoyed having you, and we'd love to have you on any other time. I mean, we can extend it to however. So
hey, this is TV. You never know when I might end up being up there at some point in my career. I almost was at Fox Charlotte, and I was almost at LOS.
No!
So you never know.
LOS, baby. You need to come home to Asheville.
You can ask Tim, and I'm not saying this to kind of make us guys feel good, but I think Tim will agree. We have a really good weather community in the state of North Carolina, and I think we all work well together, and we'd love to have you up here anytime.
But he's got oysters and cheap beer, so he says, so he might be in good shape.
That's it. And the only time you'd see Florida State players would be in the ACC championship. So. But anyways, thanks for coming on tonight, guys. We appreciate it. And next week, Weather and Your Health with hopefully John Wendell from NBC Charlotte. And make sure you like us on Facebook. And go by and give Tim and Chris, go by and tell them thank you for coming on tonight. I'm Scotty Powell with the Carolinas Weather Discussion. Hope everyone has a great night, and we'll see you next Wednesday.